Welcome, everyone, to The Deep Dive. We're the podcast where we take complex topics, really dig into them, distill the key information, and hopefully provide you with those essential nuggets of knowledge you need.
That's the goal.
Today, we're embarking on, well, a particularly deep dive into a place that consistently captures global headlines. It's been, for centuries really, a crucible where history, geography, and human aspirations collide with just extraordinary intensity.
Yeah, it's a place that almost seems to encapsulate so many layers of complexity. Sometimes it feels like it defies any kind of easy explanation.
Absolutely. And that's why we're here. It's a truly pivotal region, and as you said, often misunderstood.
Hmm.
So for this deep dive, our mission is really to unpack those intricate layers of its history, to understand the profound impact, profound impact of its geography.
It's just huge, yeah.
And trace how both the internal dynamics, the things happening within, and the external forces have shaped its present political and territorial status.
Exactly. Our goal is to help you, the listener, understand precisely why this area is so critical and maybe shed some light on why it's so frequently misinterpreted, in global discourse.
So we are talking, of course, about the West Bank. Our journey today will start by defining what it actually is. How did it get its name? What were those initial boundaries that really set the stage for everything that followed?
Like fundamentals. Yeah.
Then we'll shift our focus to its unique geographical features. How do these dictate everything from, where people live, what they farm, to its strategic importance? We want to highlight the enduring influence of the land itself.
Which you just can't overstate in this region.
No, you can't. And finally, we'll embark on a comprehensive chronological journey through its, tumultuous history. We'll cover the complexities of the British Mandate, its annexation by Jordan,
Right.
the subsequent Israeli occupation, the hopeful but often, let's be honest, frustrated peace process, and bring it right up to the contemporary challenges, including some very recent and significant escalations.
Right. Yeah, things that are still unfolding. We'll try to examine the roles of key players, pivotal events, and really make sense of how this region arrived at its current intensely complex reality.
It's a narrative woven through millennia, really, but its modern contours, the shape we see today, are undeniably forged by the last, 80 years or so? Shifting control, profound demographic change.
That's absolutely right. The last century, especially since 1948, has been incredibly formative.
That's a crucial point. So let's jump right into our first section, defining the West Bank, a land forged by conflict and claims. So let's start at the beginning. What exactly is the West Bank, and how did its identity and boundaries, the ones we talk about today, truly come into being?
Okay, so at its most basic level, the West Bank is an area of land that was part of the former British-mandated territory of Palestine. And its name obviously comes from its location. It's west of the Jordan River.
Simple enough, geographically.
Geographically, yes, but politically, it possesses this dual, often competing identity, which is absolutely fundamental if you want to understand its ongoing complexities. From 1949 until 1988, it was claimed and effectively administered as part of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan.
Okay, so Jordanian control for a significant period.
Yes, although crucially, that annexation by Jordan had very limited international recognition, which we'll get into. But then, since 1967, following the Six-Day War, it has been under Israeli occupation.
Right, the occupation that continues today.
Exactly. And what's truly illuminating for many people, something often missed, is that within Israel itself, leaving aside East Jerusalem for a moment, which has its own complex status, the area is widely known by its biblical names: Judea and Samaria.
Judea and Samaria. That naming itself feels significant.
It's incredibly significant. This duality of naming isn't just semantics. It hints at these profoundly competing historical narratives, completely different ideological claims, and deeply held attachments to the land itself that really underpin the entire conflict.
So different names for the same place, reflecting fundamentally different viewpoints.
Precisely. For some, these are ancient ancestral Jewish lands, the heartland of biblical history. For others, they represent the core territory, the aspiration for a future independent Palestinian state. The names themselves carry the weight of those competing claims.
Wow. Okay, so these are the lands that emerged from that chaotic period after the British departure in 1948. How did its present contested boundaries crystallize out of that specific moment?
Well, the present boundaries of the West Bank were essentially forged in the crucible of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. You had the British departure in May 48, the proclamation of the State of Israel, and immediately the armies of 5 neighboring Arab countries entered Palestine.
A major regional conflict erupts.
Instantly. The ensuing war saw Israel expand its territory significantly beyond what was initially contemplated for it by the United Nations Partition Plan of 1947. That plan, remember, envisioned separate Arab and Jewish states.
Which never fully materialized that way.
No. The West Bank, as we understand it today geographically, was essentially the portion of the former British Mandate territory that remained under the control of Arab forces, specifically the Transjordanian Arab Legion, after the fighting stopped.
So the land held by Jordanian forces at the war's end.
Exactly. And the lines that delineate it weren't drawn as internationally recognized borders. They were formally established as armistice lines, ceasefire lines, effectively by the Jordanian-Israeli Armistice Agreement signed on April 3rd, 1949.
The Green Line, that's often called, right?
That's the line, yes. Often called the Green Line because it was supposedly drawn on the map in green ink. But it was explicitly stated in the agreement that these lines were not political or territorial boundaries, just a temporary military necessity.
Temporary. But they've lasted decades.
Decades. And that agreement was a critical, albeit provisional, moment. It defined the West Bank's initial administrative status under Jordan and laid down these de facto lines that would become so intensely contested in all the decades that followed.
So these were temporary military lines, explicitly not recognized political borders. And even after that 1949 armistice, it sounds like the question of who actually owned the land wasn't settled at all. It seems like it only amplified the competing claims.
It absolutely did. Far from settling the issue, the armistice lines created this new reality of deeply contested space. For decades after that agreement, this relatively small area we're talking about, approximately 2,185 square miles, or about 5,660 square kilometers.
For perspective, that's smaller than Delaware.
Roughly, yes, a small piece of land. But it was simultaneously claimed by three distinct entities. First, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, which, as we mentioned, formally annexed it in 1950, despite limited recognition.
Okay, claim number one, Jordan.
Second, Israel. Even before 1967, Israel regarded the area as strategically vital, historically significant, and potentially part of its future. After 67, of course, it occupied it and continues to claim rights there, sometimes framed in security terms, sometimes historical or religious.
Claim number two, Israel.
And third, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, which emerged over time as the internationally recognized representative of Palestinian national aspirations, aiming for an independent state primarily in the West Bank and Gaza.
Claim number three, the Palestinians via the PLO.
Exactly. The sheer number of competing claims over such a confined space tells you everything you need to know about its incredible strategic, historical, and emotional significance to multiple groups.
It really does. And what about the population living there? You mentioned demographics earlier.
Right. Demographics are crucial. As of 2024, the estimated population of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Israeli settlers, is around 4,026,000 people.
Over 4 million people in that small area.
Yes. And if you exclude the Israeli settlements, the Palestinian population is estimated at around 3,325,905. Looking ahead to 2025, the population density is projected to be quite high, around 1,926 people per square mile, or about 743 per square kilometer.
That density alone speaks volumes about the human element crammed into this contested space. So, taking all that together, the competing historical claims, the temporary lines becoming permanent facts, the dense and growing populations, what does this foundational struggle mean for truly understanding the region's persistent conflicts? Why does this specific history matter so much today?
Oh, it's the absolute bedrock for understanding it. These foundational issues, the unresolved questions of sovereignty, the competing claims, the demographic pressures, are why the conflict persists. This isn't just about lines on a map, it's about profoundly competing historical narratives, each deeply ingrained, each seen as legitimate by its adherents, and passed down through generations.
Like parallel histories of the same place.
Exactly, and deeply held identities tied to the land itself. The demographic shifts, particularly the growth of Israeli settlement since 1967 alongside the Palestinian population, exacerbate these complexities enormously. Well, it intensifies the struggle over finite resources: land, water, access, and political control. It makes finding any kind of mutually agreeable resolution incredibly challenging, because any potential division of the land has become physically harder and politically more fraught.
It creates facts on the ground.
Precisely. It's a constant, palpable tension between who has historically inhabited the land, who is physically present there now, and who believes they possess the historical, religious, or legal right to its ultimate sovereignty. This foundational lack of clarity, this contested sovereignty, has consistently hampered efforts towards stable governance, economic development,
Makes sense.
and has perpetuated this cycle of uncertainty, insecurity, and unfortunately recurring conflict.
It really sounds like the human and political story here is just inextricably intertwined with the physical land itself, almost dictated by it in
I
some
hope
way.
they
Which brings us, quite naturally, to part two, the enduring influence of geography. Let's dig into that. How do the actual physical features, the hills, the valleys, the climate, and especially the critical availability of water shape, not only daily life, but also the very nature of the conflict in the West Bank?
It's fascinating and often underestimated how directly the physical landscape dictates human activity, where people settle, how they make a living, and strategic considerations that have played out for millennia.
So what does it actually look like? What are the dominant features?
Geographically, the West Bank is predominantly composed of a series of limestone hills that generally run north-south. Think of it as a hilly backbone.
Okay, a central spine.
Exactly. Conventionally, these are referred to as the Samarian Hills, located north of Jerusalem, and the Judean Hills, situated south of Jerusalem. These hills typically average between, say, 2,300 to 3,000 feet in elevation. That's about 700 to 900 meters.
So quite elevated, rugged terrain in many places.
Yes, definitely. It's not flat coastal plain. And these hills have a significant impact on movement and climate.
How do they relate to the famous Jordan River and the Dead Sea, which are geographically so central to the region's image?
Right, they form the eastern edge. These central hills descend quite sharply, sometimes dramatically, eastward down into the low-lying Great Rift Valley. And that valley, of course, contains the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, famously the lowest point on Earth's surface.
A very steep drop-off to the east then.
A very steep drop-off. However, here's a crucial nuance. The West Bank doesn't lie entirely within the Jordan River drainage system. The watershed divide actually runs along the spine of those central hills.
Oh, interesting. So water flows both ways.
Exactly. While the eastern slopes drain down towards the Jordan Valley, the elevated western areas of the West Bank actually give rise to numerous streams and wadi seasonal riverbeds that flow westward, ultimately making their way towards the Mediterranean Sea through Israel.
I see. So it affects water resources across the border too.
Yeah. It absolutely does. And this varied topography, with its distinct ridges, deep valleys, and the sharp descent to the Rift Valley, naturally creates both barriers and corridors. This has directly influenced ancient trade routes, modern road construction, settlement patterns, and, crucially, strategic military movements and control for thousands of years.
You can see how controlling the high ground would be vital.
Always. The rise and fall of the land profoundly impacts daily life, agricultural viability, where you can actually grow things, and the historical ebb and flow of control over the territory. Controlling the hilltops offers commanding views, defensive positions, and control over routes below.
Makes perfect sense. And when we talk about geography in this arid region, water must be just absolutely paramount. Not just rivers, but rainfall too, right?
Paramount is the right word. Water availability, or more often its scarcity and its incredibly uneven distribution, is arguably the fundamental shaping force of life in the West Bank.
How variable is it?
It varies dramatically across a relatively small area. You'll find annual rainfall exceeding 27 inches, or about 685 millimeters, in the most highly elevated areas in the Northwest, particularly up in the Samarian Hills. That's relatively well watered for the region.
Okay, decent rainfall there.
But that amount drops off sharply as you move south and east. It declines to less than 4 inches, under 100 millimeters per year, in the extreme southwest and southeast, especially down along the Dead Sea Valley in the rain shadow of the Judean Hills.
Wow, from over 27 inches to under 4 inches in such a short distance.
It's a huge difference, and this stark contrast in rainfall directly dictates wildly variable land use patterns across the territory. What you can grow and how you grow it depends entirely on where you are and how much rain you get, or if you have access to other water sources.
So can you give us some specific examples of how that extreme variability plays out on the ground? What does farming look like in the wetter versus the drier areas?
Certainly. In the relatively well-watered, non-irrigated terrain of the central and northern hills, especially in Samaria where rainfall is higher, the land is typically used for traditional rain-fed agriculture.
So relying just on the rain that falls.
Exactly. This often involves grazing sheep and goats and cultivating drought-resistant crops like cereals, wheat, barley, and very importantly, olives. Olive groves are absolutely iconic to the landscape and a crucial part of the Palestinian economy and culture for millennia. You also see fruits like melons grown in these areas.
Okay, traditional rain-fed farming in the hills. What about where there's less rain or where irrigation is possible?
Right. Contrast that with the irrigated land. This is found in specific pockets within the hills where springs or wells exist, but most notably down in the Jordan River Valley, where water from the river or aquifers can be accessed.
So intensive farming is possible there.
Very intensive. This irrigated land is cultivated for a much wider assortment of fruits and vegetables, things like citrus fruits, dates, tomatoes, cucumbers, often using more modern intensive irrigation techniques like drip irrigation to maximize water use.
So a stark difference in agricultural potential based purely on water.
Absolutely. And what's crucial here, as we said, is that water scarcity and its uneven distribution aren't just environmental facts. They are persistent daily struggles. They fuel economic disparities between regions, they profoundly impact agricultural output and food security, and crucially, they contribute significantly to political friction and conflict.
How does water become a source of conflict specifically?
Well, consider the vital importance of access to the underground aquifers that lie beneath the West Bank, primarily the mountain aquifer system. This isn't just about drinking water for communities. It's essential for sustaining both traditional and irrigated agriculture.
Right, the groundwater.
Exactly. And the control over this water is highly contested. Disputes over drilling rights for new wells, water quotas allocated to Palestinian communities versus Israeli settlements, and the overall management and sharing of this finite resource are not just localized squabbles.
No, they sound like major strategic issues.
They are. They've been major sticking points in every significant peace negotiation. The control and allocation of water fundamentally shape land use patterns, determine the economic viability of Palestinian communities, and impact future development prospects. This makes water control a highly potent strategic lever, directly impacting daily survival, economic potential, and the political dynamics of the entire conflict.
That's incredibly insightful. Water, not just as a resource, but as a strategic asset, a driver of conflict, a tool of control. Moving beyond farming, how have these geographical constraints, the terrain, the water scarcity, coupled with the political realities of occupation, impacted broader economic development and connectivity for the West Bank? Has industry ever really taken off?
Unfortunately, no. Industrial development was never particularly strong in the West Bank, even during the period of Jordanian administration before 1967.
Really? Even back then?
Even back then. For example, records show that by the mid-1960s, there were fewer than a dozen industrial establishments in the entire area that employed more than 30 people. It was largely an agrarian economy with very limited manufacturing capacity.
Okay, so starting from a low base.
A very low base. And this pattern largely continued, and in many ways was significantly exacerbated by the Israeli occupation after 1967. The occupation brought substantial constraints on West Bank industrial development.
What kinds of constraints?
Multiple kinds. Investment capital, both domestic and foreign, remained scarce in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This scarcity was driven by several interlocking factors: the pervasive uncertainty over the future political status of the territory.
Makes sense. Investors hate uncertainty.
Absolutely. Plus, extensive restrictions on the movement of goods and people both within the West Bank and between the West Bank and the outside world, including Israel and Jordan. And, of course, competition from the much more developed and subsidized Israeli economy next door made it hard for Palestinian industries to gain traction.
So a tough environment for business. Was there any area of development that saw improvement?
Well, ironically, the one notable exception to this general pattern of economic underdevelopment was transportation infrastructure, roads, essentially.
Roads improved. Why?
This area saw considerable improvement after 1967, but it was primarily driven by Israeli military and settlement needs to facilitate the Israeli army's control and movement of forces, and to connect the growing number of Israeli settlements to each other and to Israel proper.
Ah, so not primarily for Palestinian benefit.
Not primarily, no. However, these improved roads did have the somewhat unintended side benefit of helping Palestinian agriculture to a degree, by making it easier sometimes to transport goods to markets and to service agricultural areas, although access to those roads could still be heavily restricted for Palestinians.
Right. That's a stark irony. Military and settlement investment leading to some marginal civilian benefit, maybe. But what about the human element? You hear a lot about the Palestinian population being highly educated. Is there a disconnect between that human potential and the economic opportunities available?
There is a massive disconnect, and you've hit on a really critical point. There is indeed an abundance of human capital among the Palestinian population in the West Bank. There's a strong tradition for valuing education, literacy rates are high, and university enrollment is significant. Many Palestinians have excelled academically, both locally and internationally.
So the potential is there.
The human potential is absolutely there. Yet foreign direct investment, which is often crucial for kickstarting industrial growth and creating jobs, remains stubbornly scarce.
Why is that? Primarily, still the uncertainty and restrictions.
Primarily, yes. It boils down largely to the pervasive economic uncertainty directly linked to the ongoing occupation. The fragmented nature of the territory, with the Area A, B, C divisions we'll discuss later, makes integrated economic planning incredibly difficult. The lack of a clear, stable legal framework for investment is a deterrent.
And the physical barriers.
And the physical barriers,
Yeah.
absolutely. Israeli restrictions on access between the West Bank and external markets, often referred to collectively as closure policies, create significant hurdles. This isn't just checkpoints. It involves complex permit regimes for importing raw materials, exporting finished goods, even for business people trying to travel to meetings.
It sounds like a bureaucratic nightmare for businesses.
It can be. Getting the necessary permits can be time-consuming, unpredictable, and costly, severely impeding trade, investment, and the development of sustainable, independent economic growth. It fosters dependence rather than self-sufficiency.
And where do people live? Where do these populations tend to cluster within the West Bank? What are the key urban centers that serve as focal points for Palestinian life and commerce?
The principal Palestinian municipalities serve as vital hubs for population, administration, and economic activity, such as it is. In the north, you have cities like Jenin and Nablus, both with long histories and serving as major centers for the northern West Bank.
Nablus is known for its old city, right?
Yes, a very significant historical center. And then there's Ramallah, just north of Jerusalem. Ramallah, along with its twin city Al-Bira, functions today as the administrative and de facto political capital of the Palestinian Authority. It's where the main government offices are located.
Okay, Ramallah as the administrative center. What about south of Jerusalem?
To the south of Jerusalem, you find Bethlehem, a city, of course, of immense historical and religious significance for Christians worldwide, but also an important Palestinian town. And further south is Hebron, known in Arabic as Al-Khalil. Hebron is a major commercial, industrial, and religious center in the southern West Bank, though also a site of significant tension due to the presence of Israeli settlers in the heart of the Old City.
A very complex situation in Hebron.
Extremely. And then down in the Jordan Valley, you have Jericho, or Ogoa in Arabic, which is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, known for its ancient history and its agriculture, benefiting from the warmer climate and irrigation.
And any others.
There's also Tulkarm, located in the west, right near the Green Line border with Israel. Tulkarm historically served as a hub connecting the northern West Bank municipalities towards the coastal plain and Tel Aviv in Israel, though its role is now heavily impacted by the separation barrier and restrictions. It highlights that complex web of interactions, dependencies, and also separations.
And education. You mentioned universities.
Yes, despite the challenges, education thrives. Several small but important universities were founded or gained university status, particularly in the 1970s, like Birzeit near Ramallah, Anaja in Nablus, Bethlehem University. They primarily enroll Palestinian students and play a crucial role in fostering intellectual capital and national identity, even under difficult conditions.
So connecting this back to the bigger picture, this lack of direct access to the sea, no independent control over borders or major trade routes, combined with the political and physical barriers imposed by the occupation. It sounds like a recipe for limited development.
It is. It profoundly impacts development potential, fosters a sense of geographic and economic isolation for many communities, and perpetuates a degree of economic dependence, either on Israel, international aid, or remittances from abroad. Geography and politics combine to really constrain potential.
And the human cost of all these decades of shifting borders, changing control, and outright conflict must be just immense, particularly in terms of displacement.
It is immense, and the displacement of Palestinian populations has been catastrophic, shaping the demographic landscape and the collective memory for generations. It happened in major waves.
Tell us about the first big wave.
The first huge wave was during and immediately after the 1948 war, the Nakba, or catastrophe, as Palestinians call it, Estimates vary, but around 300,000 Palestinians who either fled or were expelled from territory that became part of the new state of Israel sought refuge in the West Bank, which was then coming under Jordanian control. Many others continued on across the river into Transjordan proper, which later became the Kingdom of Jordan.
300,000 people flooding into the West Bank. That must have strained resources incredibly.
Incredibly. The West Bank was already relatively poor and underdeveloped, so absorbing such a large number of refugees, many of whom had lost everything, placed an enormous burden on the host communities and the Jordanian administration. Refugee camps were established, many of which still exist today as built-up neighborhoods.
And then it happened again in 1967.
Yes. In 1967, after Israel captured the West Bank in the Six-Day War, another massive wave of displacement occurred. Estimates suggest around 380,000 Palestinians fled or were pushed out of the West Bank, primarily crossing the Jordan River into Jordan.
Another huge number. Were these new people or?
That's the tragic part. Many of these were the same people or their children who had been displaced just 19 years earlier in 1948. So, for a significant portion of the Palestinian refugee population, it was a devastating second uprooting in less than 2 decades.
That's just staggering to comprehend. And it sounds like displacement continued, perhaps in different ways, particularly with unique pressures being applied in East Jerusalem after 1967.
Yes, East Jerusalem, which Israel occupied in 67 and subsequently annexed in a move not recognized internationally, became a real focal point for demographic change and pressure on the Palestinian population.
How so?
Between 1967 and 1977, official figures and human rights groups estimate that around 6,300 Palestinians were evicted from their homes in East Jerusalem, particularly from the Old City's Jewish quarter and the adjacent Mughrabi quarter, which was demolished entirely.
Evicted and replaced.
Yes, they were subsequently replaced by Jewish immigrants as part of a deliberate policy to change the demographic balance of the city and solidify Israeli control over the annexed eastern part. This wasn't just about property, it was explicitly about demography.
And residency rights became an issue, too.
A major issue. Beyond direct eviction, challenges to Palestinian residency rights in East Jerusalem continued and intensified. Official Israeli figures show that more than 14,000 Palestinians had their East Jerusalem residency permits revoked between 1967 and 2016. But a significant number, perhaps over 10,000, lost their residency status just between 1995 and 2010 under the Center of Life policy.
What was the Center of Life policy?
This policy required Palestinians with Jerusalem residency permits, who are treated as residents, not citizens of Israel, to continuously prove that their primary home, work, and family life were centered in Jerusalem. If they moved, even temporarily, for work, study, or family reasons, perhaps even to a nearby West Bank town just minutes away, they risked losing their right to live in their own city.
So you could lose residency even if your family had been there for generations.
Absolutely. Even if you had deep family roots, owned property, but had spent time living or working outside the Israeli-defined municipal boundaries, you could have your residency revoked, making it illegal for you to live in Jerusalem. This policy was widely seen as a tool to pressure Palestinians to leave the city.
So what does all this mean for understanding the region, these repeated, sustained demographic shifts?
They speak volumes about the deep, personal, and multi-generational impact of conflict and political decisions. They highlight the profound trauma of displacement, the precariousness of residency, and the ongoing challenges faced by generations of Palestinians. It's not just about statistics or lines on a map, it's about families and entire communities uprooted, their lives fundamentally altered by geopolitical forces, their connection to their homes made insecure, and their very presence in certain areas becoming contested.
That's a powerful and necessary reminder of the human story behind the political and geographical facts. Let's shift gears now and move into part 3. A century of shifting control and dynamics. This is where we trace the historical journey of who controlled the West Bank and how those dynamics changed. Let's start with the Jordanian period, roughly 1950 to 1967. What was the landscape like immediately after the British Mandate ended, leading up to Jordan's annexation of the territory?
Right. The scene immediately after the British withdrawal in May 1948 was one of immense geopolitical upheaval, violence, and uncertainty. You had the proclamation of the State of Israel, and immediately, as we noted, the armies of 5 Arab countries entered Palestine.
The First Arab-Israeli War.
Exactly. In the ensuing conflict, Israel managed to expand its control significantly beyond the territory that had been envisioned for it by the UN Partition Plan of 1947. That original UN plan, remember, had proposed dividing Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states, with Jerusalem designated as a corpus separatum, an international zone under UN administration.
But that plan never fully came to fruition.
Not at all. The proposed Arab state never materialized amidst the war and its aftermath. Instead, the West Bank, as its boundaries were eventually demarcated by that 1949 Jordanian-Israeli armistice agreement, ended up being broadly similar to, but actually somewhat smaller than, the zone that the UN had originally designated for the Arab state.
And Jerusalem. What happened to the international city?
Jerusalem, instead of becoming international, was physically divided by the fighting and the armistice lines. The western part came under Israeli control, while the eastern part, including the historically vital Old City with its holy sites, came under Jordanian control. The city was literally split in two with barbed wire and checkpoints.
A divided city. So the envisioned Arab state never came to be, and the West Bank territory ended up being formally annexed by Jordan in 1950. But you mentioned earlier that this annexation wasn't widely recognized internationally.
That's a critical point, not at all. The West Bank was formally annexed by the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, which itself had just transitioned from being Transjordan on April 24, 1950. However, this annexation was crucially recognized by only two countries: Great Britain, which had long-standing historical ties and strategic interests with the Hashemite dynasty,
And Pakistan.
and Pakistan, which offered a gesture primarily rooted in Islamic solidarity. That was basically it. Most of the international community, importantly including the Arab League states themselves, either explicitly opposed Jordan's move or simply did not recognize the annexation.
Why did the Arab League oppose it?
The prevailing view among other Arab states was that annexing the territory prejudiced the eventual rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination in their own independent state. They saw it as Jordan consolidating control over land that should eventually belong to Palestinians.
Interesting. So despite the lack of recognition, from 1950 until Israel occupied it in the Six-Day War of 1967, the West Bank was governed as part of Jordan.
Yes, for all practical purposes, it was administered as the West Bank of the Hashemite Kingdom, even though it was geographically separated from the main Jordanian population center on the East Bank by the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. West Bank residents were granted Jordanian citizenship.
How was that relationship between the two banks during those 17 years? Was it a harmonious union, or were there significant internal tensions and perhaps differing aspirations?
It was far from harmonious. It's generally described as an uneasy and complex union fraught with underlying tensions.
What were the main sources of tension?
A major factor was deep-seated Palestinian suspicion and sometimes outright resentment towards the Hashemite dynasty that ruled Jordan. Many Palestinians viewed the Hashemites as an external power, originally from the Hejaz in Arabia, imposed on the region by the British.
So a feeling of being ruled by outsiders.
For many, yes. Coupled with this were the strong, burgeoning aspirations among Palestinians in the West Bank for a separate, independent state of their own, distinct from Jordan. Palestinian nationalism was growing, and they didn't necessarily see their future tied to Amman.
And practical issues. Resource allocation.
Yes, there were also practical tensions. Many West Bankers felt that economic development funds and political power were disproportionately concentrated on the East Bank, leaving the West Bank relatively neglected and underdeveloped. There were periodic political crackdowns by the Jordanian authorities against Palestinian nationalist groups as well.
So quite a bit of friction beneath the surface.
Yeah.
But you also mentioned a web of relationships grew.
Despite these underlying tensions and differing national aspirations, the web of relationships, economic, cultural, social, familial, connecting the two halves of Jordan, did indeed grow stronger during this period. People traveled back and forth, intermarried, conducted business.
So integration happened organically to some extent.
To some extent, yes. And economically, the West Bank became quite significant to Jordan. By 1967, on the eve of the Six-Day War, West Bank residents represented a substantial portion of Jordan's overall population. Estimates suggest around 47%.
Nearly half the population lived on the West Bank.
Nearly half. And it contributed significantly to the economy, generating about 30% of Jordan's gross domestic product, primarily through agriculture and tourism, especially religious tourism, to East Jerusalem and Bethlehem.
Wow, that's significant integration, even if it was complex.
It indicates a significant, albeit complex and often fraught, level of integration. This makes the subsequent loss of the West Bank in 1967 not just a territorial loss for Jordan, but a major demographic and economic blow as well.
What's fascinating here looking back is how this Jordanian period is absolutely crucial for understanding the evolving identity of the West Bank. It seems caught in this limbo part of Jordan, but with its own nascent Palestinian nationalism bubbling up, all while being geographically and politically distinct.
Exactly. It demonstrates powerfully how external decisions, like the 1949 armistice lines and the Jordanian annexation, profoundly shaped the internal realities and created this somewhat precarious, contested existence for the territory and its people even before the Israeli occupation began.
And then came 1967, the Six-Day War, a moment that dramatically, and as it turned out, perhaps permanently, altered everything for the West Bank. The Israeli occupation began.
Yes, June 1967 was a truly transformative watershed moment for the entire Middle East and especially for the West Bank. During that swift, decisive Six-Day War, Israel launched what it termed preemptive strikes against Egypt and Syria. When Jordan, allied with Egypt and Syria, entered the conflict and began shelling West Jerusalem and Tel Aviv,
Israel responded against Jordan as well.
Israel responded forcefully. Israeli forces quickly moved into Jordanian-controlled East Jerusalem and then rapidly occupied the entire West Bank, reaching the Jordan River within just a few days. This was alongside capturing the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt and the Golan Heights from Syria.
A massive military victory for Israel.
A stunning military victory. And following this, Israel immediately established a military administration throughout the entire West Bank area. This meant Israeli military commanders held full legislative, executive, and judicial authority over the territory and its Palestinian population.
Full military rule. But you mentioned earlier there was one crucial exception right away.
Yes, one crucial and immediate exception: East Jerusalem. Unlike the rest of the West Bank, which remained under military administration, Israel took a different, decisive, and unilateral action regarding East Jerusalem within weeks of the war's end.
What did they do?
Israel effectively annexed East Jerusalem. It expanded the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem far beyond the old Jordanian lines, incorporating not just the old city, but also surrounding Palestinian villages and lands. Then it formally applied Israeli law, administration, and jurisdiction to this entire expanded area.
So treating East Jerusalem as part of Israel, not occupied territory.
Exactly. Palestinian residents within these new boundaries were offered Israeli citizenship, though most refused, accepting permanent residency status instead, and the area was treated, under Israeli law, as an integral part of Israel's capital. This act immediately set East Jerusalem apart, legally and administratively, from the rest of the occupied West Bank, laying the groundwork for the decades of intense disputes over its future status that continue today.
That's a hugely significant distinction. And what was the immediate impact on the Palestinian population living in the rest of the West Bank, now under this new Israeli military rule? Was there immediate widespread resistance, or did the occupying power take a different approach initially?
For much of the first decade of the Israeli occupation, say from 1967 into the mid-1970s, there was a period of relative, albeit enforced, quiet or calm under military rule. Major organized resistance was limited initially.
Why was that? Were people just stunned by the defeat?
That was part of it, certainly. The speed and totality of the Arab defeat in 1967 was a shock. But the relative calm was also largely maintained through a very strict and comprehensive series of military orders and administrative measures that were explicitly designed to prevent overt civil or political resistance.
What kind of measures are we talking about?
Well, for instance, the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, issued military orders right away that prohibited the display of political symbols, most notably the Palestinian flag. They restricted the distribution of any political publications or leaflets. Public gatherings of more than a few people required explicit permits from the military governor. Political parties were banned.
So basically suppressing any form of political expression or organization.
Effectively, yes. These measures created an atmosphere where widespread, organized civil resistance to the Israeli authorities was extremely difficult and risky for a significant portion of that initial decade. It resulted in a kind of surface quiet, a controlled environment.
But presumably, beneath the surface, things were different.
Absolutely. Beneath the surface, Palestinian national identity, far from disappearing, continued to solidify and even strengthen in response to the occupation. Opposition existed, but it was often clandestine or expressed in non-political ways initially. However, this initial period marks that dramatic and fundamental shift in the region's status. It initiated this new, long era of direct military occupation, which would irrevocably alter the daily lives of Palestinians, introduce a whole new set of profound dynamics to the conflict, like the settlement issue we'll get to, and ultimately set the stage for the future confrontations and uprisings.
Right. So a period of enforced calm, strict military rule laying the groundwork. And then, as you hinted, we move into the era of settlements, primarily kicking off in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s. This truly began to change the physical landscape and the demographic reality of the West Bank in a major way. How aggressive was this settlement expansion initially, and what methods were used to acquire the land?
The period of relative calm under military rule really began to erode significantly in the late 1970s and especially into the early 1980s. This coincided with Israel, particularly after the Likud party came to power in 1977, embarking on a far more aggressive, systematic, and ideologically driven course of establishing civilian settlements throughout the occupied West Bank.
So a marked shift in policy around 77.
A very marked shift. This wasn't just a few isolated outposts, it became a state-sponsored project. The expansion was rapid. By the early 1980s, the number of these Israeli settlements, often planned as permanent self-contained communities with their own infrastructure, numbered in the scores, dramatically altering the demographic map and geographic realities on the ground.
And the land. Where did the land for these scores of settlements come from?
That's where it becomes highly controversial. The methods used to acquire land for these settlements were varied and often fiercely contested by Palestinians and international legal bodies. They included several key mechanisms.
Such as?
One major method was declaring Palestinian land as state land. Israel took over the land registry previously managed by Jordan and used or reinterpreted complex Ottoman-era land laws to declare vast tracts, particularly uncultivated hilly areas traditionally used for grazing, as belonging to the state, the Israeli state, as the occupying power.
The uncultivated land doctrine you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. That doctrine became a primary tool. Another method was the outright expropriation or confiscation of privately owned Palestinian land, often declared necessary for military purposes initially, but then later turned over for civilian settlement construction.
Seizing private land for military needs that become settlements.
It was a common pattern. Land, businesses, and sometimes even buildings were expropriated from Palestinian inhabitants. And crucially, many of the Palestinians affected by these land confiscations were already refugees from the 1948 or 1967 displacements, meaning they now faced a second or even third dispossession or loss of property and livelihood within the West Bank itself.
That adds another layer of tragedy. And you mentioned the pace accelerated under a specific leader.
Yes, the pace of settlement construction and population growth accelerated dramatically under the government of Prime Minister Menachem Begin, whose Likud-led coalition governed Israel from 1977 to 1983. Begin himself was a strong proponent of the idea of Greater Israel, viewing Judea and Samaria as integral parts of the Jewish homeland.
So an ideological drive was central.
Very much so. During his tenure, official figures show the number of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, excluding East Jerusalem, more than tripled, and the number of Israeli settlers living in them increased by more than fivefold. This marked a very conscious policy shift towards actively encouraging and embedding a large, permanent Israeli civilian presence throughout the territory, making future withdrawal far more difficult.
That's an incredible rapid rate of change in just a few years. And this controversial uncultivated land or state land doctrine, how much land are we talking about potentially?
That was and remains a crucial point of contention. Israel put forward claims, as we said, of a right as the occupying power to administer, control, and allocate land in the West Bank that it deemed state land, often based on interpretations of Ottoman law regarding land that was miri, state-owned but usable, or mowat, so-called dead or uncultivated land.
How much land fell into those categories, according to Israel?
The estimates varied wildly, but Israeli interpretations suggested this category could amount to anywhere between 30 and perhaps even up to 70% of the entire West Bank, depending on how uncultivated, unregistered, or privately owned was defined, surveyed, and adjudicated, often by Israeli military committees.
30 to 70%. That's a vast amount of the territory.
A huge potential amount, and Palestinians naturally viewed this entire process with deep suspicion and hostility. They argued that much of this land, even if not intensively cultivated year-round or lacking modern title deeds, was traditionally used for grazing flocks, Seasonal farming, like wheat in rainier years, belonged to villages under customary communal title, Musha land, or simply hadn't been registered properly under previous administrations.
So they saw it as a land grab using legal loopholes.
Essentially, yes. They saw it as a clear legal pretext for widespread land confiscation, designed to dispossess them and facilitate settlement expansion. This doctrine, and the way it was applied, fueled very strong suspicions among Palestinians that Israel's ultimate intention was to annex the area piecemeal, effectively carving it up, controlling strategic locations and resources, and creating irreversible facts in the ground that would make a contiguous, viable future Palestinian state impossible.
You can certainly understand those suspicions given the scale. So during this period, the 70s and 80s, you have Israel increasingly viewing possession of the West Bank as vital for its security, often citing the need for strategic depth.
Right. That argument was constantly made. Controlling the central mountain ridge prevents an easy invasion route towards Israel's main population centers on the coast.
And on the other hand, you have this rapidly growing number of settlements driven by ideology as much as security, making it increasingly difficult politically and practically for any Israeli government to even consider relinquishing control. What was the diplomatic situation like during this era, given this intensifying reality on the ground?
The diplomatic situation was essentially one of stalemate and paralysis throughout the 1970s and 1980s. The issue of Israeli rule over the West Bank Palestinians and the future status of the territory remained profoundly unresolved, creating a persistent diplomatic impasse.
Israel wouldn't budge on security and settlements.
Israel consistently regarded its control over the West Bank as vital to its security, as you said, and the growing number, size, and political influence of the Israeli settlements and the settler movement further stiffened the unwillingness of successive Israeli governments, particularly Likud-led ones, to contemplate withdrawal or relinquish control. These settlements weren't just dots on a map. They developed into established towns with roads, infrastructure, political lobbies, and a strong ideological commitment to remaining.
And the Palestinian side, what was the PLO's stance?
Simultaneously, the chief political representative of the West Bank Palestinians, the PLO, based mostly in exile at that time, consistently refused to negotiate directly with Israel. The PLO charter called for Israel's dismantlement. And crucially, until a major policy shift in 1988, the PLO was unwilling to explicitly recognize Israel's right to exist within any borders.
So no recognition, no negotiation from the PLO side either.
Not directly with Israel, no. And Israel, in turn, refused absolutely to negotiate with or recognize the PLO for many years, even after 1988, viewing it primarily as a terrorist organization responsible for attacks against Israeli civilians.
A complete deadlock then. No talking, just conflicting actions on the ground.
A profound, decades-long diplomatic deadlock. There were various peace plans floated by third parties, but neither side was willing or able to make the necessary compromises to engage directly. If we connect this back to the bigger picture, the relentless settlement expansion during this specific period fundamentally altered the geopolitical landscape. It wasn't just about security anymore, it was actively reshaping the territory in a way that made the internationally favored two-state solution increasingly difficult to even envision physically due to the fragmentation of Palestinian areas and the deep entrenchment of Israeli communities across the Green Line.
It really lays bare how deeply held security concerns, powerful ideological convictions about the land, and political maneuvering can combine to profoundly shape the physical realities on the ground, creating facts that become incredibly hard to reverse.
Absolutely. It set the stage for the explosions to come.
Which brings us to a significant turning point, towards self-government and renewed conflict, covering roughly 1987 to 2000. This period saw the intifadas, but also the Oslo Accords. Let's start with Jordan's role changing again, and the eruption of the first intifada. What happened there?
Okay, two major things happened almost simultaneously, fundamentally shifting the dynamics. First, in July 1988, Jordan's King Hussein made a truly pivotal and somewhat unexpected announcement. He declared that Jordan was officially renouncing all administrative and legal responsibility for the West Bank.
Wow. After claiming and administering it for decades, why?
It was a monumental strategic shift. He effectively severed Jordan's remaining formal connections with the area, canceling a Jordanian development plan for the territory and dissolving the Jordanian parliament, which included West Bank representatives. His stated reasons included respecting the PLO's claim, asserted more strongly at an Arab League summit, to be the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people and allowing the Palestinians to pursue their own statehood independently.
So stepping aside to let the PLO take the lead politically.
That was the official rationale, yes. Though Jordan did continue to maintain its historical custodial role over the Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem's Old City, which it still does today. But this disengagement decision was partly a recognition of the reality of growing Palestinian nationalism and the increasing international legitimacy of the PLO.
And the second major event happening around the same time.
The second event, which actually began slightly earlier in December 1987 and likely influenced Hussein's decision, was the outbreak of a massive popular uprising among the Palestinians living under occupation in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In Arabic.
The Intifada. What sparked it, and what did it look like?
It was largely spontaneous, though building on years of simmering frustration, daily friction with the occupation, economic hardship, and a feeling of hopelessness regarding any political solution. The immediate trigger was a traffic accident in Gaza, where an Israeli army truck crashed into cars carrying Palestinian laborers, killing 4. This sparked protests that rapidly spread throughout Gaza and the West Bank.
And it wasn't led by exiled politicians.
Initially, no. It was a genuine grassroots uprising. It was characterized by widespread civil disobedience, things like tax resistance, boycotts of Israeli goods, mass resignations of Palestinian police working for the Israelis. There were also mass demonstrations, commercial strikes, and very visibly stone-throwing by Palestinian youths, often targeting Israeli soldiers and settlers.
The images of children throwing stones at tanks became iconic.
Those images captivated global attention. The Intifada quickly became a virtually permanent feature of daily life in the West Bank and Gaza for the next 6 years, despite continuous and often harsh attempts by the Israeli army to suppress the widespread disorders using tactics like curfews, mass arrests, deportations of activists, house demolitions, and lethal force.
So, a sustained popular challenge to the occupation from within.
Yes. It fundamentally changed the perception of the conflict, highlighting the untenable nature of the status quo and the depth of Palestinian desire for self-determination. It put immense pressure on Israel and forced the international community, particularly the United States, to re-engage much more seriously with finding a political solution to the Palestinian question.
So, Jordan steps back formally, and the Palestinians themselves rise up in this sustained popular uprising. This must have created a new dynamic, one that perhaps unexpectedly led towards diplomacy, towards the Oslo Accords, which became a moment of real hope for many. How did secret negotiations even start between long-standing enemies like Israel and the PLO?
You're right. The First Intifada undeniably played a crucial role in shifting the political landscape and creating conditions, however difficult, that pushed both sides towards considering diplomacy, albeit secretly at first. The Intifada demonstrated to Israel the high cost militarily, economically, and internationally of maintaining the occupation indefinitely through force alone. It also empowered a local Palestinian leadership within the territories, although the PLO leadership in Tunis remained the primary address.
And for the PLO?
For the PLO, the Intifada showed the power of popular mobilization, but also the limits of achieving liberation through uprising alone. It also faced pressure after the first Gulf War, having backed Iraq. So secret back-channel negotiations, facilitated by Norwegian diplomats and academics, began quietly in Oslo, Norway, starting in January 1993.
Oslo. Why Norway?
Norway offered a neutral, discreet location, away from the glare of international media and the formal, often stalled, peace processes happening elsewhere, like the Madrid Conference framework. These talks involved Israeli negotiators, initially academics close to the Labor government, and senior representatives of the PLO, despite Israel's long-standing official policy of refusing to recognize or negotiate with the PLO.
So a breakthrough behind closed doors.
A major breakthrough. These highly sensitive, clandestine discussions ultimately led to a stunning agreement between the State of Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization in September 1993. It was formally called the Declaration of Principles on Interim Self-Government Arrangements, but universally known as the Oslo Accord, or Oslo First.
Signed on the White House lawn, famously.
Yes, with that iconic handshake between Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat, brokered by U.S. President Bill Clinton. It was a moment of incredible historic hope.
What did the agreement actually lay out? What was the plan?
The Oslo Accord laid out a framework, a roadmap, for gradually extending Palestinian self-government in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip over a 5-year interim period. The stated aim was to reach a final, permanent settlement on all outstanding issues: borders, refugees, Jerusalem settlements, security, by May 1999.
So a step-by-step process towards a final deal.
Exactly. The core mechanism was transformative, at least in theory. Israel's direct civilian and military administration over Palestinian population centers would gradually be dissolved in specified areas.
Hmm.
The Israeli army would withdraw from populous Palestinian urban centers and redeploy to other locations. Authority would be transferred to a newly established Palestinian governing body,
The Palestinian Authority.
Palestinian Authority, or PA. It was conceived as an interim self-governing body responsible for administering Palestinian life in the areas from which Israel withdrew.
And how was this ambitious plan actually implemented on the ground? How did it translate into tangible changes, especially the famous and now deeply entrenched Area A, B, and C divisions of the West Bank?
Actual implementation of the Oslo framework began quite quickly in May 1994 with the signing of the Cairo Agreement. This marked the first tangible step. Israel's withdrawal from the town of Jericho and its immediate environs in the West Bank, and from most of the Gaza Strip, excluding settlements and military areas.
So Jericho and Gaza first.
Yes. This initial redeployment paved the way for the creation of the Palestinian Authority. PLO chairman Yasser Arafat returned dramatically from decades of exile to head this new PA, setting up headquarters initially in Gaza and later in Ramallah.
A huge symbolic moment, Arafat's return.
Absolutely enormous. Then, the following year, 1995, with the signing of the Oslo Second Accord, or the interim agreement on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the next major phase was implemented. This agreement formally divided the West Bank, and only the West Bank. Gaza was treated slightly differently into three distinct administrative zones.
Area A, B, and C.
Exactly. Area A, B, and C. These zones were intended to delineate varying levels of Palestinian authority control and Israeli security responsibility during the interim period, supposedly leading towards greater PA control over time.
Can you break down what each area meant?
Sure. Area A initially comprised the major Palestinian cities and towns, places like Ramallah, Nablus, Jenin, Bethlehem, Tulkarm, Qalqilia, Jericho, Hebron, with a special protocol for the Israeli presence there. In Area A, the Palestinian Authority was given full responsibility for both civil administration and internal security. Israeli troops withdrew completely from these areas.
Okay, full PA control in the cities. What about Area B?
Area B consisted mostly of Palestinian villages and rural areas surrounding the Area A cities. In Area B, the PA was responsible for civil administration, things like education, health, infrastructure, but security remained a joint responsibility between the PA and Israel. This meant the Israeli army retained overriding security control and the right to operate within Area B.
So PA runs daily life, but Israel handles security.
Essentially, yes. Israel had overriding security responsibility. And finally, there was Area C.
And Area C.
Area C comprised the largest chunk of the West Bank initially, about 60–62% of the land area. This included all existing Israeli settlements, all Israeli military bases and installations, vast tracts of sparsely populated land, areas designated as state land or nature reserves, and the borders with Jordan. In Area C, Israel retained full civil administration and full security control.
60% under full Israeli control, including all the settlements.
Precisely. This zoning created a highly fragmented map, often described as a leopard skin or archipelago, with Palestinian areas A and B existing as islands within a sea of Israeli-controlled Area C. This complex administrative reality profoundly impacted daily life for Palestinians. For instance, Palestinians living in Area C faced, and still face, severe restrictions on building homes, developing businesses, accessing farmland, or even moving freely, often requiring permits from the Israeli military administration, known as Kogat, for nearly everything.
It sounds incredibly complex and potentially designed to constrain Palestinian development even within the peace process framework.
That's certainly how many Palestinians and critics viewed it. While presented as an interim arrangement, the division into A, B, and C, particularly the vastness of Area C under full Israeli control, became deeply entrenched and created significant obstacles to creating a contiguous, sovereign Palestinian state.
So it was a complex pathway, perhaps hopeful initially, but clearly fraught with potential problems. And we know, tragically, that the peace process ultimately began to unravel. What were the key turning points, the major events that led to its collapse and the onset of renewed and even more violent conflict?
Tragically, yes. The hope generated by Oslo began to fade relatively quickly, and the process started to fall apart. A pivotal, devastating blow came with the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in November 1995.
Assassinated by an Israeli.
Yes, by a right-wing Jewish extremist who vehemently opposed the Oslo Accords and the idea of trading land for peace. Rabin had been Arafat's partner in the process, a figure who, despite his military background, had shown the courage to pursue peace. His death removed a crucial, indispensable Israeli leader genuinely committed to the agreement's success.
A massive loss for the process.
A massive loss. His successor, Shimon Peres, tried to continue, but the political atmosphere in Israel shifted. This was followed by a wave of devastating suicide bombings carried out by Palestinian militant groups, particularly Hamas, who opposed the Oslo process from the start. These attacks killed scores of Israelis and severely damaged Israeli public support for the peace process.
So violence from rejectionist groups on both sides undermined trust.
Exactly. And this led in 1996 to the election of Benjamin Netanyahu as Israeli prime minister. Netanyahu, leading the Likud party, had been an outspoken critic of the Oslo Accords from the beginning, viewing them as dangerous to Israeli security and compromising Jewish claims to the land.
So a leader less committed to Oslo took power.
His government was far less enthusiastic about implementing the agreements, particularly the further troop withdrawals, known as further redeployments, that were scheduled under Oslo II. Settlement construction also continued, albeit perhaps at a slower pace initially than under Begin, but it didn't stop.
So the process stalled.
The process significantly stalled. By the year 2000, 5 years after Oslo II, despite earlier expectations that Palestinians would have achieved full autonomy or even statehood, by the end of the 5-year interim period, May 1999, the reality was very different. The Palestinian Authority directly controlled less than 1/5 of the West Bank Area A, with partial control on another roughly 20% Area B. Full Israeli occupation, sometimes combined with PA local administration in B, continued in the vast majority of the territory, Area C.
That must have led to immense Palestinian frustration.
Immense frustration. Palestinians felt the process was not delivering on its promises, that the occupation was deepening through settlement growth, and that they were left with fragmented cantons rather than a path to a real state. The final status issues Jerusalem, borders, settlements, refugees remained unresolved and seemed increasingly intractable.
And what was the final spark that ignited the Second Intifada?
The status of Jerusalem, always the most sensitive issue, proved to be the catalyst. In September 2000, the then leader of the Israeli opposition, Ariel Sharon, a figure deeply controversial among Palestinians for his past actions, particularly regarding Lebanon, made a highly publicized and deliberately provocative visit to the Temple Mount compound in Jerusalem's Old City.
Known to Muslims as Haram al-Sharif, containing Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Exactly. The site is the holiest in Judaism and the third holiest in Islam, making it incredibly volatile. Sharon's visit, surrounded by a massive police escort, was seen by Palestinians as an assertion of Israeli sovereignty over the site and a grave provocation.
And that triggered the uprising.
It triggered widespread Palestinian protests the next day, which were met with a forceful Israeli response. The situation rapidly escalated. Frustration among Palestinians, simmering for years over the stalled peace process and continued occupation, boiled over into a new, far more violent uprising, often dubbed the Al-Aqsa Intifada or Second Intifada.
How is it different from the first?
The Second Intifada was characterized by much higher levels of violence on both sides. It involved widespread armed clashes, frequent suicide bombings carried out by Palestinian militant groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad inside Israeli cities, killing hundreds of civilians, and large-scale Israeli military incursions, assassinations of militant leaders, sieges of Palestinian cities re-entering Area A, and the construction of the controversial separation barrier, largely inside West Bank territory. It lasted for nearly half a decade and resulted in thousands of deaths. Mostly Palestinian, but also many Israeli.
A truly devastating period.
Utterly devastating, and it effectively buried the Oslo peace process. This whole period really highlights the dramatic peaks and valleys of attempts at resolution. It shows how initial genuine hopes for self-determination and peace met insurmountable obstacles, violence, lack of trust, political assassinations, continued settlement building, and the failure to resolve core issues. The Oslo Accords, while a landmark historical moment, ultimately created a complex, arguably unworkable administrative reality on the ground that, in many ways, continues to shape daily life and exacerbate, rather than resolve, many of the core issues of the conflict.
It's a very stark reminder of how quickly hope can turn to renewed and even worse conflict, and how fragile peace processes can be. This brings us into the more recent past and present, into Part 4, Contemporary Dynamics Division, Diplomacy, and Escalation. Let's start with a crucial internal development. The Hamas-Fatah split, which occurred between 2006 and 2007, this really deepened internal Palestinian divisions in a way that persists today. What caused the initial electoral shift away from Fatah, and how did it ripple through the Palestinian political landscape?
Right, the Hamas-Fatah split, which fully crystallized with Hamas's takeover of Gaza in 2007, was a profound internal upheaval. It fundamentally reshaped Palestinian politics, creating two separate geographical and political entities. Its origins lie in the January 2006 Palestinian parliamentary elections.
The Legislative Council elections.
Exactly. In those elections, Fatah, the long dominant party, the party of Arafat and his successor Mahmoud Abbas, the leading faction within the PLO, suffered a decisive and, for many observers, quite unexpected loss to Hamas.
Hamas won the election.
Hamas won a clear majority of seats in the Palestinian Legislative Council. This electoral shift wasn't out of the blue, though. It was a clear reflection of years, really, of deep public dissatisfaction among many Palestinians with Fatah's governance since the establishment of the PA under Oslo.
What were the main criticisms of Fatah?
Fatah was widely criticized, fairly or unfairly, as being corrupt, inefficient, increasingly autocratic, and perhaps most importantly, for failing to deliver on the core promise of the Oslo Accords, an end to occupation and the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. There was a sense of stagnation and disillusionment.
And Hamas offered an alternative.
Hamas campaigned effectively on a platform emphasizing resistance against the Israeli occupation, upholding Islamic values, and significantly highlighting its reputation, particularly in Gaza, for providing robust social welfare services, schools, clinics, and being relatively less corrupt than Fatah cadres were perceived to be. They capitalized heavily on the public's disillusionment with the peace process and Fatah's leadership.
So protest vote in many ways, but also support for Hamas's platform. How did the international community react to this victory, given that Hamas was, and largely still is, designated as a terrorist organization by Israel, the U.S., the EU, and others?
The international reaction was swift, negative, and ultimately decisive in deepening the crisis. Hamas's victory immediately created a major diplomatic and financial crisis for the Palestinian Authority. The international community, led by the United States and Israel, and followed by the European Union, collectively known as the Quartet, along with the UN and Russia, refused to deal with a Hamas-led government unless Hamas met three conditions.
What were the conditions?
Hamas had to. First, explicitly recognize Israel's right to exist. Second, renounce violence. And third, accept all previously signed agreements between Israel and the PLO, namely the Oslo Accords.
Did Hamas accept these conditions?
No, Hamas refused to accept these conditions outright, although it did offer proposals for a long-term truce. As a result, the international community, which provided a huge portion of the Palestinian Authority's budget, responded with severe sanctions and boycotts against the Hamas-led Palestinian government.
What did the sanctions involve?
It meant an almost immediate cutoff of vital direct financial aid to the PA. Israel also withheld hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenues that it collected on behalf of the PA under the Oslo agreements. This crippled the Palestinian Authority's ability to pay salaries to its tens of thousands of employees, teachers, police, civil servants, and provide basic public services.
That must have paralyzed the government and created immense hardship.
It did. It further destabilized the already tense political landscape and put immense pressure on the newly elected Hamas government, making it incredibly difficult for them to govern effectively.
And this international pressure and the internal Fatah-Hamas rivalry contributed directly to what became a critical internal split, essentially fracturing Palestinian governance into two. Can you elaborate on how that final break happened?
Precisely. The international boycott, coupled with the deep ideological, strategic, and power-sharing differences between the Islamist Hamas and the secular nationalist Fatah, led to months of tension and eventually an increasingly violent power struggle, particularly spilling onto the streets of the Gaza Strip. Efforts to form a national unity government between the two factions proved short-lived and ultimately failed.
When did it come to a head?
In June 2007. Amidst escalating armed clashes between Hamas and Fatah security forces in Gaza, and following the collapse of the unity government, PA President Mahmoud Abbas, based in Ramallah, took a decisive step. He dismissed the Hamas-led government headed by Ismail Haniyeh and declared a state of emergency, establishing an emergency cabinet in the West Bank that decisively favored his own Fatah party.
So Abbas essentially fired the elected government.
That's how Hamas saw it. This move intensified the internal conflict, which culminated in Hamas forcibly taking full exclusive control of the Gaza Strip after a brief but bloody internecine conflict, ousting Fatah forces completely from the territory.
So a physical takeover in Gaza.
Yes. This resulted in the de facto political and territorial split that largely persists to this day. The West Bank came to be run by Fatah through Abbas's emergency PA government, later normalized, based in Ramallah, while the Gaza Strip fell under the full, independent control of Hamas.
Two separate Palestinian entities emerged.
Effectively, yes. In response to this split, Israel and other members of the international community quickly moved to support the Fatah-led PA in the West Bank. They restored financial aid, offered diplomatic backing, and coordinated security efforts with Abbas's forces, largely aiming to isolate Hamas in Gaza. Simultaneously, a comprehensive and crippling economic blockade was imposed on the Gaza Strip by both Israel and Egypt, justified on security grounds due to Hamas's control, but causing immense hardship for the civilian population there. This internal division profoundly impacted the Palestinian political landscape, creating two distinct, often antagonistic centers of power, weakening the overall Palestinian national movement, and significantly complicating any unified strategy for achieving statehood or negotiating effectively with Israel. It presented a fragmented, divided leadership to the world, which remains a core challenge for Palestinians today.
A truly damaging split with long-lasting consequences. So with the West Bank now firmly under Fatah's control via the PA, we enter what's often called the Abbas era, running roughly from 2007 through the 2010s. What was the strategy for the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank during this period post-split? What were its main aims?
Right.
With Fatah consolidating its control in the West Bank after the Gaza takeover, President Abbas appointed Salam Fayyad as prime minister of that emergency cabinet. Fayyad was a respected figure, an independent economist formerly with the World Bank and IMF, seen as technocratic and favored by the international donor community.
So a figure aimed at restoring stability and international confidence.
Exactly. During his tenure as prime minister, which lasted from 2007 until 2013, the Palestinian Authority under his direction pursued a highly ambitious and widely discussed agenda, often termed neoliberal state building in the West Bank.
State building, what did that involve?
The primary aim was quite explicit: to demonstrate Palestinian capacity for effective self-governance and to build the institutions, infrastructure, and economy of the West Bank to prepare it for eventual statehood, regardless of the stalled peace process with Israel. It was often called the Fayyad Plan or Palestine, ending the occupation, establishing the state.
What kind of practical steps did this state-building agenda include? It involved significant reforms across various sectors. A major focus was on security sector reform, professionalizing the PA security forces, trained largely by the US and EU, to establish law and order in Area A cities, often cracking down on both criminal elements and Hamas supporters. Another key element was fiscal discipline and transparency, trying to build a sound financial base, improve tax collection, and reduce corruption to reassure international donors.
And building institutions.
Yes, a major emphasis was placed on developing robust governmental institutions, strengthening ministries, improving the judiciary, developing the civil service, creating national standards for education and health. The overarching goal was to build, from the bottom up, a state in waiting, essentially proving to the international community and perhaps to Israel that Palestinians were ready for and capable of running their own independent state effectively and responsibly.
So creating the apparatus of a state even while still under occupation. How did this pursuit of state building within the West Bank translate onto the international stage, particularly in terms of seeking recognition for that state?
That became the next logical step. By 2011, after years of the formal peace process with Israel remaining completely stalled and facing growing frustration domestically over the lack of progress towards ending the occupation, the Palestinian Authority under Abbas shifted its strategy towards the international arena. They began lobbying aggressively for international recognition of Palestinian statehood based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital, primarily through the United Nations, but also via bilateral diplomatic efforts.
The UN statehood bid. How successful was that?
It saw some significant, though largely symbolic, success. The attempt to gain full UN membership via the Security Council in 2011 ultimately failed due to a lack of sufficient support and the near certainty of a U.S. veto. However, the PA pivoted to the UN General Assembly, where no veto exists.
And what happened there?
In November 2012, the UN General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to upgrade the status of Palestine from an observer entity to a non-member observer state. This was a major diplomatic victory. While it didn't confer full UN membership or immediately change the reality on the ground, it carried significant political weight. It allowed Palestine to join various international bodies and treaties, including the International Criminal Court, ICC, which opened up potential avenues for seeking accountability for actions related to the occupation. Many individual countries also upgraded their bilateral recognition of Palestine around this time.
So diplomatic progress on the world stage. But what about Fayyad himself, the architect of the state-building plan? How is he viewed domestically?
That's the paradox. Despite the progress in institution building and gaining international plaudits, Salam Fayyad struggled to garner a wide base of genuine popular support among ordinary Palestinians. He was often perceived, rightly or wrongly, as a technocrat, too close to the international community, especially the U.S., and the dictates of donors, and perhaps insufficiently connected to the daily struggles, political prisoners' issues, and nationalist sentiments of the broader population. His austerity measures were also unpopular at times.
So respected internationally, but less so at home.
To a large extent, yes. He ultimately resigned as prime minister in April 2013, partly due to political friction with Fatah leaders, but also as the Palestinian Authority faced a severe financial crisis. This crisis was largely exacerbated by Israel periodically withholding the tax revenues it collects for the PA, and by a significant reduction in promised aid from international donors, particularly Arab states. It highlighted the persistent economic vulnerabilities inherent in trying to build a state while still under occupation and dependent on external factors.
A tough balancing act. So despite these ambitious efforts towards state building by the PA, what was happening simultaneously on the Israeli side regarding its presence and control over the territory during the 2010s? How did that affect the long-term vision of a Palestinian state being pursued by Fayyad and Abbas?
That's the other side of the coin, and it reveals the stark, deeply consequential paradox of this entire period. While the Fatah-dominated PA was working tirelessly in Ramallah and other Area A cities to establish itself as an independent, functioning government in waiting,
Building the state.
Israel, simultaneously, continued and even accelerated the expansion of its settlement activity throughout the West Bank, particularly in Area C, but also effectively expanding the footprint around Jerusalem.
So settlement growth didn't stop during the state-building period.
Not at all. It continued robustly under successive Netanyahu governments. This expansion included not just the internal growth of existing large settlement blocks, but also the construction of thousands of new housing units within them, and significantly, the de facto or sometimes de jure regularization of previously unauthorized outpost settlements built often by ideological hardliners without initial government permission, but later connected to infrastructure and approved retroactively.
Creating more facts on the ground.
Relentlessly creating more facts on the ground. This continuous settlement expansion created an ever-deepening physical and demographic reality that severely, perhaps fatally, undermined the feasibility of achieving a contiguous, viable, and sovereign Palestinian state based on the 1967 lines. The settlements, their associated infrastructure, like settler-only roads, and the fragmentation of Palestinian land made the map look increasingly like Swiss cheese, making a clean territorial division almost impossible.
And how was this viewed internationally?
These actions were widely, almost universally, criticized internationally by the UN, the EU, and even often by the U.S. State Department as illegal under international law. Specifically, the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits an occupying power from transferring its own population into occupied territory, and as preempting the outcome of any future peace negotiations by unilaterally determining the future of the territory.
But the criticism didn't stop the expansion.
Largely, no. Israel disputed the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Convention and argued historical and security claims to the land. By the close of the 2010s, the political rhetoric within Israel itself had shifted significantly further to the right. Many influential voices within the governing coalition and even government ministers were openly calling for the formal annexation of large parts of the West Bank, particularly Area C and the Jordan Valley.
Annexation talk became mainstream.
It moved from the fringes much closer to the mainstream of Israeli political discourse, signaling a potential abandonment of even the pretense of a two-state solution for many on the Israeli right. This period vividly illustrates that constant tension and paradox. The Palestinian Authority trying to build the institutions of a state in the areas it controlled, while the occupying power continued to shape and fragment the very territory designated for that potential state through settlement expansion and creeping annexation, making the entire state-building project seem increasingly precarious and perhaps futile to many Palestinians.
A truly challenging dynamic. And this brings us right up to the most recent and deeply concerning period. Recent escalations covering roughly 2022 to the present day. This has truly been a volatile and increasingly dangerous landscape in the West Bank. What triggered the initial wave of increased military activity, violence, and confrontations starting back in 2022?
Yeah, the period beginning in early 2022 saw a really significant and worrying uptick in tensions and violence across the West Bank, even before the events of October 2023. It started with a wave of deadly attacks carried out by individual Palestinians, sometimes affiliated with militant groups but often acting alone, against Israeli civilians and soldiers inside Israel proper.
Attacks inside Israel originating from the West Bank.
Yes, several high-profile attacks in cities like Tel Aviv, Bnei Brak, and Hadera caused shock and prompted a major security response from the Israeli government. The response manifested primarily as the Israeli Defense Forces launching frequent, large-scale, and often intense raids across the West Bank.
Raids where specifically?
The raids particularly targeted the northern West Bank cities and adjacent refugee camps, areas like Jenin and its camp, Nablus and its Balata camp, and also Tulkarm. These areas were seen by Israel as hotbeds of renewed militant activity, with newly formed or resurgent armed groups emerging, often composed of younger Palestinians disillusioned with the PA.
And the stated goal of these raids?
The explicitly stated aim was to root out these militant cells, arrest suspected members, confiscate illegal weaponry, and prevent further attacks inside Israel. However, these raids often resulted in heavy gun battles between Palestinian fighters and the IDF, frequently leading to casualties.
Casualties on both sides.
Primarily Palestinian casualties, including militants but also civilians caught in the crossfire, or during clashes that erupted around the raids. The confrontations became more frequent, more intense, and deadlier. Tragically, 2022 quickly became the deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank in nearly 2 decades, since the end of the Second Intifada. It set a very grim precedent for the heightened tensions and cycle of violence that unfortunately only continued to escalate.
A cycle of attack and retaliation intensifying.
Exactly. It created this pervasive sense of insecurity, anger, and despair for Palestinians living under increasingly frequent military incursions and heightened anxiety for Israelis fearing further attacks. The PA security forces often seemed unable or unwilling to confront these new militant groups effectively, further complicating the situation.
And then came the horrific events of October 7, 2023. Hamas's unprecedented assault on southern Israel from Gaza fundamentally changed the entire regional dynamic overnight. How did that massive attack and the subsequent war in Gaza impact the situation in the West Bank specifically, beyond the already heightened tensions we were seeing?
The impact was immediate, profound, and overwhelmingly negative for Palestinians in the West Bank. Hamas's surprise and devastating assault resulting in the deaths of around 1,200 Israelis and the taking of some 240 hostages, the deadliest single day in Israel's history, reverberated instantly and intensely across the West Bank, even though the attack originated solely from Gaza.
How did Israel react in the West Bank?
The Israeli military, the IDF, swiftly moved to implement even more stringent and widespread restrictions on movement within the West Bank, far exceeding what was already in place due to the raids in 2022. This involved the complete blocking of entrances and exits to many Palestinian cities, towns, and villages with earth mounds, concrete blocks, or manned checkpoints, effectively placing communities under lockdown or siege.
Isolating communities entirely.
Effectively isolating them, severely disrupting daily life, access to work, education, healthcare, everything. Simultaneously, there was a dramatic stepping up of IDF raids and arrest campaigns across the West Bank. These became almost daily occurrences, particularly targeting those refugee camps in the north, Jenin, Balata, Nur Shams near Tulkarm, but also occurring in Ramallah, Hebron, and elsewhere throughout the ongoing Israel-Hamas war in Gaza.
What was the stated objective of these intensified raids post-October 7th?
The objectives were multiple. Primarily to prevent any potential sympathetic uprising or large-scale attacks originating from the West Bank in support of Hamas or exploiting the situation, to arrest individuals suspected of links to Hamas or other militant groups, and generally to assert overwhelming Israeli security control during a time of national crisis. However, these raids often led to more intense clashes and a rising death toll among Palestinians in the West Bank as well. The sense of collective punishment, heightened surveillance, and the tightened grip of the occupation became incredibly palpable for ordinary Palestinians, even those with no connection to Hamas or Gaza.
And what about Israeli settler activity during this post-October 7 period? We've heard particularly disturbing reports internationally about a significant increase in violence and perhaps even attempts to establish new outposts.
That's a critical and extremely alarming aspect of the post-October 7th landscape in the West Bank. There was a well-documented and significant surge in attacks carried out against West Bank Palestinians, by vigilante Israeli settlers.
What kinds of attacks?
These attacks ranged from harassment and intimidation to the destruction of property cars, homes, water tanks, the uprooting or burning of olive groves, which is a direct attack on Palestinian livelihood and heritage, and outright physical assaults, sometimes resulting in Palestinian deaths. Worryingly, human rights groups reported that these attacks often occurred with little or seemingly no intervention from nearby Israeli security forces, creating a climate of impunity.
And weapons and settlements became more common.
Yes, tragically, this period also saw a deliberate policy promoting a proliferation of gun permits and weaponry within the Israeli settlements. This was especially pushed by Israel's far-right National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who publicly encouraged armed civilian patrols and made it easier for settlers to obtain firearms, framing it as necessary for self-defense but raising fears of increased vigilantism.
And new outposts being created.
Yes. In some of the most egregious cases documented by rights groups and journalists, settlers, sometimes violently, seized Palestinian land, often grazing land near existing settlements, and established new, unauthorized outposts, effectively expanding the settlement footprint by force. These actions drew significant international condemnation.
Did the international community react?
Yes, in a relatively rare move, the United States government, under the Biden administration, imposed sanctions, including visa bans and financial restrictions, against a small number of specific Israeli settlers, settler leaders, and even a couple of organizations identified as being directly involved in this wave of violence and outpost creation in the West Bank. It signaled a notable level of U.S. frustration with these actions, even if the impact was limited to those specific individuals and entities.
A significant, though targeted, international response. And then most recently, we saw Israel announce a large-scale offensive in the West Bank in August 2024. What prompted that, and what were the stated goals and specific tactics of this major operation?
Right. In late August 2024, following an attempted suicide bombing near Tel Aviv, which thankfully failed to cause mass casualties, but for which militant groups based in the northern West Bank claimed responsibility, Israel announced the launch of a major large-scale military offensive across parts of the northern West Bank.
A declared offensive, not just raids.
Yes, publicly declared as a sustained offensive, framed as necessary to prevent further terrorist attacks originating from the territory, and, in their words, to dismantle the terror infrastructure that they argued had taken root, particularly in areas like Jenin and Tulkarm.
What did this offensive look like on the ground?
As part of this operation, the IDF implemented extensive blockades on roads surrounding major Palestinian urban centers and refugee camps in the north, including Jenin City and Camp, Tulkarm City and its Ner Shams camp, and the Al-Farah refugee camp near Tubas. Large numbers of ground forces, supported by aerial surveillance vehicles like drones and sometimes helicopter gunships, entered these densely populated areas.
What were their tactics inside these areas?
The tactics reported included house-to-house searches, widespread arrests, clashes with local militants, and controversially, the systematic destruction of roads and infrastructure using armored bulldozers. The IDF stated this was necessary because militants were planting increasingly sophisticated, improvised explosive devices, IEDs, under the roads to target their vehicles.
Destroying roads suspected of having explosives.
Yes, but the scale of the destruction often severely damaged water pipes, sewage lines, and electricity networks buried beneath, impacting the entire civilian population. There were also reports of Israeli forces tightly controlling access to hospitals, sometimes entering them, based on claims that militants might be hiding or receiving treatment there, which raised concerns from medical organizations.
So a major escalation with significant impact on civilian life.
A very significant escalation, marking a new level of sustained military intervention in Palestinian population centers, reminiscent in some ways of the height of the Second Intifada. If we try to connect this to the bigger picture, these recent events, the escalating raids since 2022, the post-October 7 crackdown, the surge in settler violence, and now this large-scale offensive collectively reflect a significant and deeply worrying escalation of tensions.
It feels like a breakdown of previous frameworks.
It really does. A breakdown of the previous, albeit always fragile, frameworks for managing the conflict and maintaining some semblance of stability, like the PA's security role in Area A, seeming increasingly marginalized or bypassed. There's also an increasing entanglement of the West Bank situation with the broader regional conflict dynamics, particularly the war in Gaza and tensions with groups like Hezbollah. It raises profound and urgent questions. What might these accelerating patterns of violence, control, and counter-violence suggest about the future of the region? And perhaps more grimly, does any viable path towards a lasting political solution, particularly a two-state solution, remain possible amidst such deeply entrenched realities and escalating conflict?
Those are heavy questions indeed. So to try and recap our deep dive today, we've really journeyed through a lot. We've explored how the West Bank's very identity is this complex, often painful product of shifting historical claims and conflicts, going right back to the end of the British Mandate and the crucial 1948 war.
Yeah, the foundations are key.
We've seen how its unique and often challenging geography, the hills, the valleys, the stark water scarcity, profoundly shapes daily life, economic potential, and strategic control, making the land itself a constant factor in both prosperity and conflict.
The geography is destiny in many ways there.
And we've traced how this dynamic interplay of both internal factors like the rise of Palestinian nationalism, the subsequent Fatah-Hamas split, and powerful external factors, primarily the decades-long Israeli occupation, the settlement enterprise, international interventions or lack thereof, and the impact of broader regional wars has led the West Bank to its current, incredibly volatile and deeply uncertain status.
It's that combination of history, geography, internal politics, and external pressures that makes it so complex.
Absolutely. Understanding the why behind the constant headlines, getting a sense of the deep roots of its current reality, truly requires this kind of historical and geographical deep dive, looking beyond the immediate events.
Indeed, it's a region where, as you walk around, every rock, every valley, every ancient terrace seems to contribute to the current, incredibly intricate and often tragic reality. The layers of history, Ottoman, British, Jordanian, Israeli, Palestinian, are literally visible on the landscape, making it a living, breathing testament to continuous struggle, resilience, and aspiration.
That's a powerful image. So, to leave our listeners with something to think about, given the West Bank's incredibly long history of evolving claims, contested territories, and the deep, undeniable imprint of its geography on its destiny, thinking beyond the current grim realities, what future scenario, however unlikely it might seem right now, do you think could fundamentally alter the dynamics, the cycles of conflict that we've explored today?
A fundamental altering. That's a tough one.
And perhaps more critically, what extraordinary confluence of events, or maybe what kind of radical shift in perspective among the key players and the international community do you think it would genuinely take for any such transformative scenario to actually become a reality? It's a complex, maybe even a hopeful thought to chew on, but one that this deep dive, we hope, has given you, our listeners, the context and the depth to truly ponder.